We got to do some catch up since I missed out on last week. So we got to do a little bit of catch up. We finished about halfway through, well, not even halfway through, chapter 14 of the book of Ezekiel, and we were going to cover a good chunk last week, about, 30 plus verses or so. We don't have time to cover that and this week, so I'm going to give you the short version recap of the end of Ezekiel chapter 14. Some of you who have been here with us know that for the book of Ezekiel, we've been kicking around again and again and again false prophets, false prophets, false prophets. There's false prophets in Jerusalem, there's false prophets in Babylon. And the question is, for the people, who's the real prophet? Whose message is actually going to come true? Are there false prophets? Is Ezekiel's giving them a different message? So who's going to be the one who God ends up doing what they said, and then it gets revealed then that there are the true prophet and who is the false prophet. In this case, Ezekiel's telling the people, city's going to be destroyed. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And the false prophets are saying, Jerusalem's not going to be destroyed. The righteous people are in Jerusalem. And the righteous people are in Jerusalem, and those who are unrighteous have been exiled to Babylon. And what Ezekiel's been trying to tell them is it's actually the opposite. There are no righteous left in the city. And so when God comes and destroys it, it's going to be just. It's going to be righteous, his judgment of the city, because the remnant's already in Babylon. And so he's been trying to convince the people of this. And so he, in the last part of chapter 14 of Ezekiel, tries to play with their logic a little bit. Look, there's no righteous people in Jerusalem. And even if there were righteous people in Jerusalem, they could only save themselves. They wouldn't be able to save the city. And so he goes and he talks about Daniel, and he talks about Noah, and he talks about Job. And he says, look, even if there were righteous people in the city, they could only save themselves. The city will be destroyed. But then there's a twist. Like I said, when we're going through the prophets, every time we come back to the same topic, and it comes up again, and it comes up again, there's always something extra. There's always something else tacked on to the topic that gets repeated. And so at the end of this chapter 14, the interesting thing is there's a twist. There is going to be another group of people that when the city's destroyed, God picks them up and brings them to Babylon. And when they arrive in Babylon, number one, Ezekiel's going to be proven to be the true prophet, because he's going to be the one who's been telling them the city's going to be destroyed soon. So when this last wave of exile is going to get there, they're going to confirm that Ezekiel's the true prophet. What they're also going to do is they're going to bring comfort to the people who are in Babylon. And when you first read through it, you think, well, that would make sense, right? I mean, the people who are there, who are concerned about their family that's still back in Jerusalem, they're going to see them arrive, and they're going to be like, oh, God spared my family, and now they're here, and he spared these people. But the twist is this at the end of the last chapter. The people who are in Babylon are not going to be comforted by the fact that God saved some more and brought them to Babylon. The description is this. The people who are in Babylon are going to witness and see the conduct of the exiles who come to Babylon, and they're going to be comforted by the fact that God's judgment of Jerusalem is just. In other words, the people who come from Jerusalem are going to be so corrupt, so idolatrous, so anti-God, that when they get to Babylon, the people in Babylon are going to say, oh, God is righteous in his judgment. Oh, he did exactly what he said he would do because the people are just as corrupt as he said they were. And so they're going to be comforted, but they're not going to be comforted by the fact that people are coming to Babylon safe by God's hand. They're going to be comforted by the fact that God's justice is never meaningless, that God's justice is never unwarranted, that these people are just as corrupt as they said. And that's going to be the twist. So that's the end of Ezekiel chapter 14. We're going to see false prophets come up again in the book. So we don't need to keep going. We'll see them come up again, and there'll be more information about them. So Ezekiel chapter 15. Ezekiel chapter 15. I need you to appreciate the metaphors in this book. If you don't appreciate the metaphors that come in the rest of the book of Ezekiel, or at least through chapter 24, you're either going to be bored or bummed out, or you're going to hate the book by the time we're done with it, okay? So I need you to embrace the metaphors, but what I need you to do is look past them. And when I say look past them, I say look through them to Jesus Christ and see if you can figure out how is it that God's speaking about Jesus, even in these metaphors that Ezekiel is going to give to the people in exile. about who God is and what he's doing. So that's what I want you to do. It's going to be somewhat difficult because the metaphors seem obscure. They seem abstract. They seem just kind of random. They're not. They're not. So I want you to kind of dig in with me as we go through the metaphors the next few weeks and try and find out where God is revealing Jesus as we go through these. So Ezekiel chapter 15, this is not a hard metaphor. In fact, he's going to give us the metaphor and then he's going to interpret it for us or for the people who he's speaking to. So it's not going to be a hard metaphor to understand, but it is going to beg the question, what does it tell us about Jesus and how does it even apply to us? So Ezekiel chapter 15, starting in verse 1, you'll notice on the sermon guide and also on the screens that I'm using the New English Translation. New English Translation. That's not a normal translation for us. We don't normally use that. I'm using it because there are so many discrepancies in the text of the Bible that we normally use here. I didn't want to explain them to you all. I didn't have time for that. So I said, I'll find a better translation. So for this chapter, we're going to use the New English Translation. If you have it on your phone, look for New English Translation. And you'll see maybe some of the differences as we go, and you'll be able to kind of understand. If that makes you question your English Bible, please don't. Please don't. If you're wondering, why do we have 12 English translations or 15 English translations? It's because there's 8,000 words in the Hebrew Bible, give or take, plus or minus. There's 170,000 English words in translation right now. And so if you're wondering why do some translations translate this way and some translations translate this way, it's because people have all kinds of ideas about what's the best way to translate the Hebrew. And so some translations at different times give you better, more accurate English translation. So sometimes we use different ones. I try not to do that often, but in this case it was necessary. So Ezekiel chapter 15, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, that's Ezekiel. He says this, here's the metaphor, here's the analogy. Verse 2, Son of man, all of the woody branches among the trees of the forest, of all of them, what happens to the wood of the vine? Can wood be taken from it to make anything useful? Or can anyone make a peg from it to hang things on? No. It's thrown in the fire for fuel. And when the fire has burned up both ends of it, it is charred in the middle. Will it be useful for anything then? Indeed. If it was not made into anything useful when it was whole, how much less can it be made into anything when the fire has burned it up and it is charred? So here's the analogy. A guy goes into a forest and he's looking for something to build his house, or he's looking for something to build his business out of. Wood, strong, something tangible that I can use, cut up, form, craft. I can use it as tent pegs. I can build with it. And he finds lots of building materials in the woods, and then he looks at the vine. And the vine isn't useful to build anything. It's flimsy. The only thing that the vine is good for is to be pulled up and set aside, and it dries out, and then it's thrown into the fire. And it's useful to be thrown into the fire as fuel, but other than that, it's not useful at all. So, next couple verses is your interpretation, verse 6. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Like the wood of the vine is among the trees of the forest, which I have provided as fuel for the fire, so I will provide the residents of Jerusalem as fuel. I will set my face against them. Although they have escaped from the fire will still consume them. Then they will know that I am the Lord when I set my face against them. Some of you remember the metaphor from Ezekiel chapter 5. He cuts the hair of his head and he cuts the hair off his face. And it's supposed to symbolize the people of God. And then he does different things with his hair. Some of it he throws into the fire to symbolize people that are going to be destroyed by the destruction of the city. And then he takes some of it and he chops it with the sword. And some people are going to die by the sword. And then he takes some of it and he scatters it to the wind. And the exiles go out from Jerusalem. And he takes some of it, the hairs, and he tucks them in the edge of his robe. And then if you remember the metaphor, at some point after that, he then takes some of those hairs that are inside the edge of his robe that he's preserved, and he takes them out and he also throws them into the fire. That's verse 7 here on repeat. I will set my face against them. Although they have escaped from the fire will still consume them. That's the group of people that were formerly tucked away by God, and then now they're going to be destroyed. Then they will know that I am the Lord. And then here is the final judgment, verse 8. I will make the land desolate because they have acted unfaithfully, declares the sovereign Lord. Notice the problem goes beyond just the people. You ever wonder why God has to make a new heavens and a new earth? We're very familiar, we talk about in church all the time how sin has corrupted us. How we're a corrupt people and God has to remake us. We have to believe in Jesus. He has to renew us, transform us, change us. And we talk a lot about that, but the land is also corrupt, desolate, because of our unfaithfulness. For the people of God, specifically the land that they lived in, because of their unfaithfulness. But that's going to translate in the end of all things to the whole earth. And God's going to remake the earth along with us because the land's been defiled by the people. It's the same for us. So the metaphor is not hard to understand, this one. This is a fancy way of God saying to Jerusalem, you are useless to me. You are like a vine that I can't do anything with. I can't build with it. It's flimsy. It's useless. It's not useless. It is useful. It's only useful, though, for you to display my wrath and my anger and my fire. Very colorful way of God saying to the people, you're useless but to be destroyed. You're useless but to display my wrath. So cheers. You can go home now. I need you to look beyond the metaphor. That's the metaphor that we have. And for the people of God, it should have been very clear. If you were useless to me before I put you in the fire and burned you up, when you come out, you're definitely going to be useless to me now, burned at both ends. But I want you to go beyond the metaphor. Why does God use this analogy? Why does he use the analogy of a vine? I mean, he could have said any way that he wanted to. He could have said, you people are useless to me other than to display my wrath. He could have just said that outright. And some of you would have been much happier with that. God just coming along and saying, you know what, you're useless to me other than to display my wrath. So, and you would have been like, whew, thanks Ezekiel, now we finally get it. But he didn't. He used this metaphor. So the question is, why? Why does God use the analogy of Jerusalem as a vine? Is it just one more fanciful, creative way for Ezekiel to tell the people that they're going to be destroyed? Or is there something else going on? Remember, God is speaking through the prophet Ezekiel. He told him, you're only going to say what I tell you to say. So if God's speaking through the prophet Ezekiel, why the metaphor? Why the fanciful language? This is not the only place in the Old Testament where Israel or Jerusalem or Judah is described as a vine. There's multiple other places, so we've got to go look at those places. The first one is Hosea chapter 1. Follow the analogy with me here. Dig into it so you can figure out what God's doing. Hosea chapter 1, it says this, Israel was a fertile vine that yielded fruit. And as his fruit multiplied, he multiplied altars to Baal. And as his land prospered, they adorned fertility pillars. That's other idols that they worshiped. So they were a fertile vine, but they were fertile in their production of idolatry. They weren't producing people who worshiped God and were committed to God. They were producing fruit that multiplied fertility pillars and idolatry, idol worship. Isaiah chapter 5. The parable of a vineyard which is Israel, which God planted and provided everything necessary for its growth, hoping that it would bear proper grapes, proper fruit, edible grapes. And then you go down to verse 4. But it yielded wild grapes, sour grapes. The Hebrew literal is it yielded stink fruit, which they translate sour grapes. Verse 7. Down in verse 7, for this is the vineyard of the Lord of hosts. The vineyard is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his delightful plant. At the beginning, God planted them. I want you to be a blessing to the nations. It's the Abrahamic covenant that Scott was talking about up here. I planted you in this land, and then you're supposed to be a blessing to the nations. But they weren't a blessing to the nations. They bore stink fruit instead. In Isaiah chapter 27, God is the keeper of this vineyard. So God is the one keeping it. Not only did he plant it, he's the one keeping it. And no matter how hard he tries to keep it, the people of God, they don't produce good fruit. They only produce stink fruit, wild grapes, foreign. This metaphor is going to repeat in the book of Ezekiel. We'll see it again in chapter 17 and then again in chapter 19. But one last Old Testament reference, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 21. This is what God says to the people in Jerusalem. Jeremiah is a contemporary of Ezekiel, and he's speaking in Jerusalem at the same time Ezekiel speaking in Babylon. He said this, I planted you in the land like a special vine, a true vine of the very best stock. Why in the world have you turned into something like a wild vine that produces rotten grapes, foul-smelling grapes? I planted you in good spot. How is it that you then produces wild grapes? Somebody tell me where Jesus talks about the vine in the Gospels. Say it again. John 14. Try the next chapter. 15. Good. John chapter 15. All throughout the Old Testament, the vine is Israel, the vine is Israel, the vine is Israel, but it's never talked about in a positive way. The vine is always corrupt in the Old Testament. The vine always bears stink fruit. The vine is completely useless to God, only to be thrown into the fire and burned. That's the description of the vine in the Old Testament. A vine that needs redemption, or a vine that needs transformation, a vine that needs to actually bear good fruit the way that it was supposed to. Listen to what Jesus says, John chapter 15. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Does it make sense why some people will describe Jesus as the true Israel? Because in the Old Testament, Israel is the vine, but they can never bear the fruit that God wants them to bear. It doesn't matter how much he cultivates, doesn't matter where he plants them, they continually bear wild grapes. Idolatry, and they play the harlot with the nations, and they chase after other things. They don't follow God. And then Jesus comes along and he says, I'm the true vine. I'm the one vine who's actually going to bear good fruit. I'm the one who's not going to bear bad fruit like every other human being has. Jesus is the true Israel because he's the singular representative of the people of God. You get why he has to be sinless, right? Because if he's not sinless, then he just bears stink fruit like all the rest of us. John chapter 15, verse 5, down a couple verses, Jesus says, after he says, I'm the true vine, he also says this, I'm the vine and you are the branches, talking to believers. The one who remains in me, Jesus says, and I in him, he's the one who bears much fruit. Because apart from me, you can accomplish nothing. Apart from me, you can only bear stink fruit. But if you want to bear good fruit, if you want to bear the fruit of God, you have to be connected with the true vine. Because if you're connected with every other vine that there is, any other vine that the world offers to you, you won't end up bearing good fruit of God. You want power, you want life, you want salvation. It's found in unity with Jesus Christ. Lots of you appreciate living in America. You appreciate the freedoms that come with living in America. I appreciate the fact that I can stand here, speak to you about Jesus Christ. You can't do that all over the place. But real power, real life, real satisfaction, real rest, real peace, you will not find that as a part of a nation. Lots of people thought, I'm a part of Israel, so I'm good, we're good. And then Paul tells the Roman church, not all of Israel is Israel. Who cares if you're circumcised if you don't follow after God? There's real life, there is real power, there's real restoration, there's real renewal, but it comes being united with Christ, not being united with a nation, no matter how great the nation is. What everyone has experienced who's not united with Christ is what they're experiencing, and you and I have felt it before in our lives, and maybe you're still feeling part of it is the perishing, dying, slow fade. Doesn't matter how much you fight, scratch, claw, chase after, whatever it is, money or a career or a family or a marriage or a relationship or whatever. It's like this just slow fading, this perishing. And that's what it's like to live disconnected from the vine, the one who gives true life, the true vine. Verse 6, John chapter 15, Jesus says, if anyone does not remain in me, he's thrown out like a branch. It dries up, and such branches are gathered up and thrown into the fire and burned up. Those who do not bear the fruit that God desires will display the wrath of God. I've said this before in various kind of different ways, but all of us will display the character of God for all eternity. All of us. You will either display the character of God that is his wrath, that is his justice, that is his holiness, that requires punishment for those who decide they want to sin and violate God. You can choose to display the character of God that way for all eternity. You can choose that. Or you can choose a different way of displaying the character of God. The only way you and I avoid being a branch thrown into the fire is to abide in Jesus Christ, to stay close, to remain in him. Now, some of you, when you look at the New Testament and Jesus talking about these things, it's like, well, okay, Jesus must have just knew his Old Testament and knew the metaphors, and he did. But look at how the psalmist, one psalmist, puts these two metaphors together even before Jesus. Last one, and then we're done. Psalm chapter 80. Psalm chapter 80, starting in verse 7. Listen to the vine that gets connected with the Son of Man. Long before Jesus ever came on the earth and claimed to be the true vine. Psalm chapter 80, verse 7. O God of hosts, the psalmist writes, restore us and cause your face to shine upon us, and we will be saved. You removed the vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it. You hear the Exodus? Israel is the vine. They pulled right out of Egypt, went to the promised land, and God planted them there. The mountains were covered with its shadows, and the cedars of God with its boughs or branches. It was sending out its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river. It was spreading out to all the nations around it, and it was supposed to be a blessing to the nations around it. But instead of spreading out its branches and its roots to the nations around it to bless them, it spread them out to play the harlot with them. And then the psalmist asks this, why have you broken down its hedges so that all who pass the way pick its fruit? A boar from the forest eats it away, and whatever moves in the field feeds on it. He's describing this destruction of the land and the people, the removal of the people from the land. O God, the psalmist says, of hosts, turn again now, we beseech you. Look down from heaven and see, and take care of the vine. Begging God, why are you doing this? He's telling the people, because you're useless to me. Even the shoot which your right hand planted on the son whom you have strengthened for yourself, it is burned with fire and cut down. That's the vine. Burned with fire and cut down. They perish at the rebuke of your countenance. And then listen to how the psalm switches from the vine to an individual, from a nation to a person. Verse 17, let your hand be upon the man of your right hand, upon the Son of Man whom you made strong for yourself. Then we shall not turn back from you. Revive us, and we will call upon your name, O Lord God of hosts. Restore us, cause your face to shine upon us, and we'll be saved. The whole point of this psalmist crying out is, save us, change us, transform us. But he's watching history play itself out. You pulled a vine from Egypt, you planted them, they were doing great, and then all of a sudden you let them be destroyed. Save us, change us, redeem us. But even the psalmist knows that that salvation is going to come through a Son of Man, a person, a Savior, a Messiah. It's all right there in the psalm, and it's right there in Jesus' words. And here's the beauty of the metaphor. They're not picked arbitrarily. Here's what that means. God gave Ezekiel this metaphor to give to Jerusalem about its destruction. But even in the metaphor that he gave to Jerusalem about its destruction, he was already planning its redemption. Don't you see? He was already planning for Jesus to come and restore. Already planning for Jesus to come and say, I'm the true vine. I'm here to be the vine that you can't be. He was already planning it. Look past the metaphor about the destruction. Look to the rest of the scripture and look to the beauty of what God's doing, even in the midst of destruction. He's setting out a metaphor that highlights Jesus Christ as the Redeemer, the Restorer, the one who would actually save, the Son of Man. The question is, how will you display the character of God for eternity? Will you display the character of God being a branch that's useful for nothing but fuel to the fire? Or will you come over here, receive Jesus Christ, live for him, and you can put on display for all eternity the character of God that is forgiveness and redemption and restoration and love, sacrifice of his Son? Some Christians claim to live over here, but the reality is they still bear a whole bunch of stink fruit. Why are you bearing stink fruit when you've been redeemed and restored, and renewed? That's a heritage that is separate from Jesus Christ. This, redemption, restoration, love, forgiveness, grace. This is the fruit that you bear in Jesus Christ. Bow your heads with me, please. God, you don't make everything for us perfectly simple for us to understand. Sometimes we have to search. Sometimes we have to look hard. But God, it's all there for us to believe in Jesus Christ, for us to be restored by the true vine. We can read the book of Ezekiel and we can stay stuck on the justice and the wrath. Or we could look into these metaphors that you give to the people. And we could look and see at a God who has a plan for redemption and restoration. God, we all need to give up our pride, to give up our bitterness, to give up our anger, to give up our selfishness. We have to let go of our fruit that doesn't look like you. But it's difficult. God, humble us. Remind us that you're the true vine and we're not. That no matter how hard we try to bear good fruit apart from you, we produce stink fruit. And God, change us and transform us to produce good fruit. Connect us with Jesus Christ. Don't let us stay in a place where the only thing that we're useful for is to be burned up, to display your wrath for all eternity. Give us a knowledge of the scriptures that goes beyond just the words on the page. Help us to connect the dots and see you working. Help us to see you working in our own life, not just in the scriptures. Open our eyes so that we can see through your eyes. God, we thank you for your Son, that in him we have life. We pray this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.